So hi, I'm going to talk about integrating seed saving into a market garden. So I'm part of Tournesol Cooperative Farm. Tournesol is French for sunflower. It's a similar word to girasol in that it means turn to the sun. It's also a play on words in that it means turn the soil. And we're a worker co-op that started about 15 years ago. And we started with 5 people who've now expanded to be 7 members of the co-op. And we have 6 additional staff, so there's 13 people on our farm. And this afternoon, I'll be talking about how we run a worker co-op and about running a farm with people. So our farm is fairly diverse, and part of the way that it's been able to do that is because we've been a lot of people who've been supporting this operation. And so at this point, we have a market garden. We grow 500 weekly CSA vegetable baskets on about 6 acres. And that was sort of the foundation of the farm that's grown. But even from the beginning, we were saving seeds. And so the seed company at this point is about 35% of our sales. We have an online store, so people can order directly and have it shipped to their house. But we're also in about 60 different grocery stores and health food stores, mostly in Quebec, but across Canada. And so we produce our seed on 1 acre of production. And that's about 70% of the seeds that we sell. And about 30% of the seeds we sell we're getting from other farmers or farmers out west who have better climate than we do for certain crops. And I would say, in terms of the market garden, we use about 20 to 30% of our own seeds, but we buy a lot of other seeds to grow the vegetables that we're selling for all kinds of reasons. And in addition to that, I also write about seed. I have a blog, goingtoseed.net, so if you love hearing about seeds, this is the place to be. Okay, and so let's start off by talking what seeds should you grow. If you are a market gardener and you have limited time, as was pointed out in the previous presentation, what you do at that time. So I'm going to make some questions that you asked. First off, look at the seeds you're already using. What seed is an open pollinated and what seed is a hybrid? Now, hybrids, if you save them, you won't get exactly what you started with. And if you're trying to have a specific thing in your garden, you want to start with open pollinated. So first look at what open pollinated varieties do you already use and that do you already like. Another question is consider how much seed do you use? If you just use 10 or 20 seeds of a type for something small, it doesn't have as much of an impact on your farm. If you're using 10, 20 pounds of something, saving that seed will give you more control. Also consider how expensive is that seed. Some seed is very cheap and some seed is pretty expensive. Being able to save seed that has a big cost will have an actual financial impact on your farm. You have to think about what kind of climate you grow in, because not all seed grows well in all places. And this is the reason that the seed industry has separated and gone across the world. So there are certain climates where it doesn't rain much in the summer, and that's great for certain kinds of seeds. Certain climates where it stays very cool, and certain plants prefer that. So you have to know what your climate is. And so as I gather about Indiana, it's hot and fairly humid in the summer. Is that right? Yeah? I'm not getting a confirmation on that. Yeah. And I think that's true for us in general too. And so these are some climate challenges that hot and wet can have. So umbels, that's the carrot family. Chenopods is the beet family. And alliums, that's the onion family. Those crops, you can produce seed in this climate, but they're what's called naked seeds. They're kind of exposed out in the air. They're not wrapped up in a pod. And that makes them more susceptible to the ambient humidity in the air. And that causes extra challenges. Heading brassicas, like a broccoli, a cabbage, a cauliflower, those also are much trickier, often related to weather situations. So these are crops that on our farm we don't really aim for our main seed production, and we'll be looking elsewhere. But then there's other crops that we do, and we'll talk about what crops might be perfect for hot and humid. Another question is, where do you grow your seed crop? So do you grow it in a dedicated seed area where you just have things in little blocks, or do you grow it in your field, in your vegetable crops? And so I'm going to look through a number of different vegetables, and some crops work very well in your vegetable production. But other crops, it's better to put them in a separate area. And there's different reasons for that. But some of them are that in your vegetable area, when you've harvested the crop and you move along, the seed crops usually last longer. And so they can be very annoying to have in the middle of a field, one row or a part of a row. And so the person who's running the tractor, incorporating cover crops, they're going to get angry at you if you just have a small seed crop in the middle. So that's one difference. Another difference is how you irrigate. If you're using drip tape, you're pretty okay in any case. But if you're using overhead irrigation, when you're starting a seed crop, usually overhead irrigation is fine. But once it starts to go to flower and it starts to dry down, those are stages that you don't want the plant to get wet at all. And if it's in the same field as crops that need regular irrigation, you're having conflicting needs. And that's another reason to keep your seed crops out of your vegetable crops in some cases. And this is a very important question. Are you going to sell this seed? If you're going to sell the seed, who are you selling it to? I guess is also a question. But if you're going to sell the seed, it's more important that you have seed that is pure and is like that it's going to breed true to type. Whereas if you're going to use that seed on farm and that seed gets cross-pollinated, you know that risk and you're able to plant and function. So you can be a little bit sloppier on some of your practices when you're saving seed. If you're going to be sharing your seed with friends, neighbors, other farmers, you can kind of be somewhere in between the more strict and kind of more loose in your standards, but you have to be transparent with whoever you're sharing that seed so that they know what they're getting. If somebody gets, I don't know, they think they get a zucchini, but half of it's pumpkins, they might not be happy if they weren't expecting that. So you'll be very transparent. So this is our farm from overhead, and the middle is mostly vegetables. What I've put in these contrasting colors is our seed gardens. So we have two purplish, magenta-ish seed gardens that are on almost the opposite sides of our farm. And there's about 1,400 feet between those two fields. And for most crops that are cross-pollinating, so crops that are easily get pollen from other plants, 1,300 to 1,500 feet distance will be good for most of those crops to keep them true to type. Not in all cases, but in smaller quantities it should be good. And so we grow one of each cross-pollinating crop in those two areas, so we can grow two crops in any specific year. There's some things like tomatoes or beans or lettuce that can grow a lot closer without crossing up. And in that case, we'll want to have more of them on our farm to be able to offer more varieties. So we'll have some in those pinkish areas, but also in the light blue areas on the outside. This also kind of creates, it's not a perfect circle, but sort of a circle around our farm of crops that are flowering. And we're here to talk about seeds, but one of the things about seeds is that and seeds are important, but before seeds is there's flowers. And flowers are really important too. Not just for the human soul, which you have to have beauty in your life, but it's also important for the agroecological impact it has. The flowers is the food source for a lot of creatures. And it's the food source for pollinators, bees, butterflies, all kinds of other insects. It's also a food source for your predator insects, which are going to go in and prey on insects you don't like. And it can be a distraction for some insects that are problems, like tarnished plant bug would often rather be in a seed crop not doing too much damage than in your eggplant crop eating every eggplant flower that you have. And so the flowers make an impact. And you know, we have a lot of diversity in terms of different names of stuff that's in a vegetable garden. But when you look at it, most vegetable gardens are kind of deserts in terms of flowers. And so finding ways to bring more flowers into your farm is a good thing for the ecosystem. Seed crops also are in the ground a lot longer than most annual crops. So they provide habitat for amphibians and and like ground beetles and other creatures. So there's a bigger place that seed can have in that seed plays in your farm when you start using those crops. And I'm not going to wax more poetically about that, but we're going to go back into the seed. So our farm's about 700 feet by 1,300 feet wide, talk about desolation. Now, one crop that drives us crazy is cucurbits. That's the family that has squash, melon, zucchini, cucumbers, watermelons in it. We're a market garden, and so we grow a lot of different of these varieties. And so it really causes an issue with us seed saving, because if we're trying to keep the variety true to type, we just can't get them isolated. And even 1,500 feet is kind of tight on that isolation. So about a mile away, in a neighbor's cornfield or soybean field, depending what they're rotating, we have a patch where we grow our cucurbit seed. And that way we can grow one of each variety or each species and not worry about it cross-pollinating. So I'm going to jump in now and talk about different crops that work really well on your market garden, and a few considerations for each of them. And then afterwards I'm going to talk a little about selling seed after I've gone through this run of seeds. So tomatoes, I think, are a gateway vegetable to seed saving. You're already saving the fruit, which is the thing that has the seed in it. So you don't have to have extra steps to grow that seed. It's just about getting the seed out. Now, one thing, and I don't have slides for it, but one thing is you take the seed out and you got to ferment it for a couple days to help with germination and help disease control. So that's a little bit tricky, but not too tricky. This is about putting it in a container on a counter for a couple days and let it get moldy, or with water in it, and let it get moldy on top, and then clean it out, and your seeds will be ready. Now, you can grow tomatoes in your market garden with your other market tomatoes without really worrying too much. There is some risk of cross-pollination, but it's very, very low. If you are selling seed commercially, be afraid of it, but if you're using the seed yourself, you might not see any or much cross-pollination from the seed that you save from two tomatoes that are side by side. So if you're growing open pollinated varieties or heirloom varieties that are OPs, there's no reason for you to have to go back to the seed company to get more. Just save that seed. And you can harvest most of the seeds for vegetable and just save the best ones for your seed crop, most of the fruit vegetable. Peppers are similar to tomatoes. You can grow them in your market garden with your other peppers, but there will be crossing. And it might not be high, but it might be like 10 or 15%, and it's going to, every generation you'll see more crossing. So this is one where if there's a specific named variety that you want to keep true to type, you can isolate it. And isolation of peppers can just be putting row cover over them while they're flowering. And that row cover will keep the bees and the birds from transmitting pollen, and you'll keep it true to type. You can't do this with all seed crops, but peppers are self-pollinating. They don't need a pollinator to get the pollen from one plant to the other. So just by keeping the plants isolated, they'll stay true to type. If you are not growing them under row cover to keep them isolated, you got to be careful about hot peppers. Hot peppers and sweet peppers will cross with each other. And that's a double problem. One, if somebody's eating a sweet pepper and they bite into it and it bites back, they might be a little bit upset. And even worse is if you're making a hot sauce and it turns out these hot peppers are actually sweet, you're in trouble. So you want to be careful of that. And so the isolation distances on a commercial scale, they're talking about 600 feet between hot peppers and sweet peppers. I think 150, 200 feet is better. But if you're growing them 10, 20, 50 feet apart, you will see occasionally a cross-pollination that you're not going to be happy with in terms of the hot and sweet. And then again, for your own farm needs, you only need so many plants, and most of the rest you can sell or eat. So we'll move towards lettuce. So lettuce is a crop that the seed, you have the vegetable part that you eat, but then it goes to flower and then produces seed. And when it goes to flower, it gets very bitter. And though the stalks are supposed to be edible, it's not commonly eaten over here. And so it's really a separate stage to get the seed. And so in that case, they're better off being grown in a seed garden to get to maturity. Alternatively, you can grow your lettuce in the vegetable garden, and as you're going through, flag the plants you like the best. And then when you destroy the rest of your plants after they're finished harvesting, you can transplant your favorite plants to a new area. And lettuce transplants fairly well. And then you can just keep that select group to go to seed. Now, lettuce is fantastic in terms of isolation distances because even side by side, you will not see crossing. If you want lettuce to cross, you have to tie the plants together so the flowers are in bloom at the same time, and the insects will go from one to the other, and then maybe you will see 1 to 2% chance of crossing, which is not very high. So I wouldn't worry about cross-pollination with this. And with lettuce, you can get many cuts of the plant as a vegetable, and it will still go to flower, and you can get seed off of it. So this is a case of, eating your cake and getting your seed too. Everybody likes cake seed. So Brassica Greens, so this would be like Mizuna or Tatsoi or Arugula. This, you probably want to start in your seed garden. These will be, it's the same thing. It's the vegetable part and the seed part is generally not the same part that you're eating, unless it may be rapini. There's a little bit more crossover. There's a high risk of crossing between Brassica Greens. And this is where it's important. Do I have another slide? No. It's really important to know the species. There's 2 or 3 species in here. The milder ones tend to be Brassica rapa, and they'll cross within themselves, and they'll cross also with turnips, but not rutabagas, and they'll cross with Chinese cabbage and rapini. And then the spicier ones tend to be Brassica gensea, and they'll cross within themselves. And then arugula is a whole different variety, species, so they won't cross together. And yeah, so they will cross. So if you have stuff of the same species growing side by side, it's going to cross up 30, 40, 50%. And it can add something that's really exciting to your salad mix, but if you want just Mizuna, you got to keep it just Mizuna. And these also, you can harvest as greens before you let it go to seed. So you can get many cuts in your salad mix and then let it go to seed. Beans and peas. This is the first case where you don't want to harvest the beans and peas as a vegetable if you're trying to also get a seed. Because the bean and the pea that's immature is what you want to dry down. So if you harvest it, it's going to dramatically reduce your yield. Now some people will go and harvest 2 or 3 pickings from their, or maybe 2 pickings from their beans, and then let the last picking go to seed. You can do that, but you're transmitting a lot of disease within the plants, and there's less chance that they're going to get to maturity nicely. But also it's going to really impact your yield. So I prefer to have a smaller patch that we just leave for seed, and we don't pick it. And you check it to make sure it's true to type. But so your veg and your seed crop shouldn't be the same. And therefore I would keep it in a separate seed garden. And here I've just seen that there's a mistake. There's actually a very low risk of crossing in beans and peas. I got to update this slide. So you can grow them almost side by side, and you won't see much crossing. Now, I'd be more careful in peas than in beans, because beans, even if there's a bit of crossing, the difference between a green bean and a yellow bean and a purple bean, there's some color differences there, but in terms of use, they're the same, unless it's a dry seed, like a dry bean. But when we talk about peas, if you have a sugar snap pea, and you have a shelling pea, and you have a snow pea, those have different uses, and when they cross up amongst themselves, you're not happy. I don't know if some of you have been growing sugar snap peas over the last 15 years, and there were certain years that the sugar snap and the super sugar snap crops were very crossed up. You get seed from the seed company, and there'd be 10 to 20% of off types. And that comes from somebody doing bad management somewhere in the process, and there's a little bit of cross-pollination, and it can spread over a couple generations. So even though they don't need big isolation distances, with peas, I would definitely isolate between dissimilar varieties. There's a hand up?
In terms of the point you made about disease and the later pickings, is that because some of the common diseases are then seed-borne?
No, it's just the plants. Sometimes you get into, especially with wax beans, like the yellow ones. So I would tend to plant beans for seed a little bit wider than maybe you'll plant for fresh picking. And so if you have plants fairly tight together, at one point, it just kind of a lot of white mold spreads through, or you'll see like stains on the pods and little disease that comes in. you're touching those plants, and then touching other plants will contaminate the plant. And now good ventilation reduces some of that, but we are the mediums for the disease. And so that's why I have grown some plants, some crops where we'll just lose it all if we don't manage the disease well. Is that clear to everybody? So, squash, the cucurbit family. And I'm including melons and cucumbers and watermelons and all this. You want to grow these far away from your vegetable garden if keeping them separate, keeping them true to type is important. Whereas in salad greens and beans and tomatoes and peppers, it can be fun to have some diversity in the crop. With cucurbits, that fun can be at cross purposes with what you want. Like a zucchini, you want an immature fruit that's very tender at this stage with not a tough skin. You want with a pumpkin, you want something that has a little bit more of a tough skin, and it might not be great at an immature stage. And so you start to have traits that are at cross purposes that are working against each other. If you're also growing gourds, in some case there can also be some bitter genes that get into there. But if you're not growing gourds, this stuff will probably be edible, but it's going to start to be really crossed up, and you won't really know where you're going with it. Now, as in the previous presentation, if you have a population of acorn squash or something that's very similar, that diversity is fine and fun. But when you have things that are very different purposes, that diversity is sometimes called the muddy middle. And it's not quite good for anything that you really want. Then there's roots. And so we're talking about radishes, turnips, beets, carrots. And most of these roots are biennials, which means that in the first year, they produce the vegetative part that stores up the energy. And the next year, they're going to take that energy and they're going to go to flower and set seed. So radishes are one of the exceptions, especially the little round radishes. If you grow them in the spring, they'll probably go to seed, to flower, and you can get a seed crop off of it. Now with roots, there's an amazing synergy with a market garden. Because of the market garden, you might be growing thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of some of these crops. And you're looking at a lot of roots. And if you choose the best roots to then use as a seed crop the next year, every year you're going to see a dramatic improvement off of those crops. And you'll see that within the first generation. Now, that means you have to look at the root. You got to choose the ones that are nice. And also, when you're saving roots to replant, you got to leave about an inch of green at the top. Whereas if you're just saving for the vegetable, you might cut it pretty flush. That's the growing point. So if you cut it too tight, you're not going to get regrowth that following year. All the root crops have very high risk of crossing. So if you want to keep them separate, grow them, only one of the species, or grow them far apart. So so the first year you get a lot of veg, and the second year plant it in your seed garden. These are some purple top, white globe turnips. A very standard turnip variety. In our first year of farming, we bought some of this seed from a seed company for about $5 a pound, which is not very expensive for seed. And we grew it out a couple years, and one year in the spring, we still had some turnips left from our personal stores, stuff that we hadn't eaten during the winter, and they were starting to root, and they were starting to get leaves on them. So I just planted out 20 or 30 of them because I just wanted to see what turnips did. And they went to flower. They looked exactly like all the other Brassica Greens. We saved the seed, and then the next fall, we grew a row of our seed and a row of the seed that we had bought initially. And this wasn't planned out. It just kind of happened that way. And when we harvested it, they were very different. They were very different. This is one generation of selection. And the seed that we had is a seed that's on the left. And they were rounder, and the purple was more vivid and more bright. They were a little less rugged, a little less gnarly. The leaves had less disease. They were just nicer plants in every regards. we hadn't saved these intentionally for seed. We had just saved nice roots that we would like to eat ourselves and hadn't kept roots we wouldn't like to eat. So just that intention of choosing stuff that we liked and then grew out, that one generation made a better turnip. Now, we were starting with $5 a pound seed, so the standards weren't very high when they first grew it out. And I've since learned that with purple top white clobe, this is grown out west, and it's mainly a forage crop. So there's an industry of seed producers that produce it just for forage. And then some of the vegetable seed companies will buy this forage seed crop and then repackage it and sell to market gardeners to feed to people. And so we are not the intended audience of this seed. So this is easy to improve, a seed that has not a lot of maintenance. Seeds there's a lot of good seed on the market too. That's been a lot of work into it. But even that seed, if you grow for 2 or 3 generations on your farm, you will see that it's going to get better. And then, so this is a population. We took some black radishes, so that's the one with the black skin and the white inside, and fairly spicy, and some watermelon radish, so they're kind of white and green on the outside with pink on the inside, and we crossed them up, and we've been selecting them for 5 or 6 years, and we've got really beautiful radishes coming out of that. Now, if you don't like radishes, it doesn't matter what they look like, but if you do like radishes, it's a rainbow. And so nobody else has this. We've begun to see some purple radishes similar to some of them in some seed catalogs, but nobody has the diversity that we have on our farm of these radishes. And that's just because we're saving seed. So as a market gardener, it can really give you a niche and a product that's unique and that you can brand separately. Kale and chard. These are also biennials. So in the first year, they're storing energy. In the second year, they're going to flower. In the first year, you can grow them in a market garden. During the winter, and it depends where you are. If you are in an area that these will overwinter easily in the field, or you just got to put a row cover under, maybe you grow them close to where you want it to be for seed the next year. But in the case where they're going to winter kill, or they might winter kill depending on those April rains and frosts and stuff, you can dig them up, bring them into a cold room, and then plant them out later. And you can get all the kale and chard you want off of these plants in their first year, and it's not going to impact the seed production. So this works really well in a market garden. And then, if you overwinter kale plants specifically, the next year these send up flowers, and you can harvest those as kind of rapini, like kale rob, and it's an amazing crop. And they're nice and sweet after having had frost during the winter. So it's like a bonus vegetable. And so if you do have a kale seed crop, I would probably harvest the first stalk, eat that or sell it, and you'll still get a lot of seed coming off of the secondary stalks. Kale and chard cross very easily, not with each other, but within themselves. One thing to know about kale is there's 2 species of kale. There's Brassica oleracea, which is the broccoli family. So dinosaur kale and the curly kales are in that family. And then the Siberian kales and the red Russian kales are in the same species as rutabaga. So they'll cross with rutabaga, but they won't cross with the curly kales. Yeah, and chard and beets are in the same family too, for those who don't know this. So that runs us through some of the crops that I think are really easy fits on a market garden. I'm going to just check yeah, we're good on time. I'm going to talk a bit about seed crop rotation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about selling seed. So there's a lot of reasons we rotate crops, but a big thing is for managing weeds and pests. And this is something that, with a seed crop, I think is a little bit different than with some other crops. So we group our crops in frost-resistant crops and in tender crops, so crops like that will winter kill. And we plant them separately. And it tends to be the same kind of families in one group, and they're different in the other group, except for beans and peas are kind of in the same family. And so we'll do 1 year, we'll do a frost-resistant crop, and we'll plant it as early as possible. The next year we'll do a cover crop. The year after we'll do a tender crop. We plant it after the frost date when the soil warms up. And the year after we'll do a cover crop, and then we'll go back to that frost-resistant crop. And doing that, we tend to have one year, one crop of the same family every 4 years, and that is really good for rotation. And seed rotation, and rotation in seed crops is important because diseases can be a problem. Now, we follow up every seed crop with a cover crop, so a year of cover crops, because you won't harvest every seed that's on the plant. Many of them are going to shatter. And even though you might love that crop, the next year, if it's unwanted, it's a weed. So you are creating your own weed problem. So if you have a tatsoi seed crop, and it shatters a lot of tatsoi into the ground, or seeds on the ground, and the next year you plant carrots, you're going to have a nightmare because all those seeds are going to come up. So we use a cover crop the following year. So one thing is, after the seed crop, we don't till it in. We leave it above ground, and we'll mow it, but we want to leave the seed on the, air, on the surface so that it'll germinate with the rains, and or some of the seed won't germinate, but mice and beetles will eat those seeds. And they're a big controller of extra weed seeds. And then the next year we'll till it under, and we'll put a cover crop, and we'll try to flush the weeds, the unwanted seeds that way. And by the following year, there's almost nothing left. So crop rotation is an important part. So I'm going to skip over this. And I'm going to jump over questions, and I'm going to go to selling seed to seed companies, and then we'll see if we can fit some questions in. So if you want to sell seed to seed companies, and I think it's totally a viable market, I would first start by learning to grow seed yourself before you start investing in selling seed to seed companies. But you have two big types of companies out there, or I don't know if big's the right word, two groups. You have some that are smaller bioregional seed companies, and then you have larger seed companies. And I'm calling High Mowing or Johnny's or Fedco a larger seed company, though in the big scheme of things, they are small fish in the multinational seed world. But from the small seed world, they're larger players. Now, small bioregional seed companies, usually a couple owners, maybe some employees, maybe some not, they tend to grow most of their own seed, buy in a little bit, and they really focus on their bioregion. They tend to sell, in the same state or the same area. And they need small quantities of seed, but they're willing to pay a higher price for it because they want it to be local. Larger seed companies, bigger more employees, these sell seeds across the country and internationally. They all buy wholesale seed. Some grow seed, but most don't. And they need a lot of seed, which is exciting, but they won't pay the same prices that a smaller company might pay. So you're playing a volume game. However, if you have varieties that no one else has, the price will be a lot higher. If you have varieties that everyone has, the price will be lower. Is selling bulk seed profitable? So most seed crops, you can generate about $20,000 to $40,000 an acre, which is comparable to a lot of market vegetable crops. So something like lettuce, you might be able to produce $40,000 of lettuce heads on an acre. Beans or broccoli might be something $20,000 to $5,000 an acre. Tomatoes, you might be producing $200,000 an acre of actual fruit if you have a good system. So it's not comparable to all crops, but most market veg crops, seed is comparable. What about if you have a micro farm, so a farm that's smaller than an acre? Seed can be a good fit, but it's tricky. Because if you have a $40,000 seed crop that takes up the whole bed the whole year, you're not leveraging that space for maximum use. Often on a micro farm, you want to flip the beds and do the same crop, a different crop year, like one after the other. So you have 3 or 4 $40,000 an acre crops. So there are ways to make it fit, but you might need a little bit more work. Now, if you're going to grow seed for a seed company, I would recommend that you talk to them about it first. You don't just grow a crop and then you say, I have this for you to buy. And they say, oh yes, I'm so happy. And sometimes they do, but if you're working on speculation, you might be disappointed. So how do you find a seed contract? Well, you go and talk to a seed company. It's as simple as that. You email them. If you're at a trade show and you're there, you ask them. They might have a buyer, or if it's a smaller seed company, you can see them. If there's a seed swap where the seed companies are present, Go up and chat with them. Not necessarily when they have a very long line in front of them. Wait till there's a lull. But seed companies are always looking for seed growers. And because there's not that many, and there's not that many great seed growers. So if you are a good seed grower, they want to find you. So you're not imposing on them. Now, it is a relationship that you're building. And this is something that's different with being a vegetable grower. And that if you're a vegetable grower and you go to a farmer's market, and you get there at the farmer's market and somebody bought something the previous week, I don't know, there was a rotten tomato or something in the court, and they bring it back, you can apologize, give them another tomato, and you can work things through, and that can become a better client. If somebody gets seed from you 1 year, and then they sell it, and then at the end of the year they get complaints from people, and they discover that it's not great seed, and that next winter, when it's time to talk to you, they're not going to call you back. And you might not know why they're not contacting you, unless you call and ask. But you have kind of one chance to build that relationship. And so you want to start small and build gradually. And now most seed companies will not just jump in right away with you. They'll start small. They'll ask around to see who else who's bought seed from you. And if you have a good reputation, they might take a bigger risk on you. But if you don't, they'll want to start small and increase. Now, as a grower, you also want to be cautious. You want to get paid. You might, like when you deliver the seed, they have to do a germ test, maybe some final cleaning. It might take, so you start the seed in March, the plants, and then you harvest in August. You ship it to them in October and November. They do a germ test in December. Sometime in February or March, you get a check. That's a year later. And so if that's a lot of seed that you've sold and you're expecting a certain amount of revenue and they don't pay you, you're going to be disappointed. So that's something that the relationship, you want to build it carefully on both sides. Now, what is my ideal grower? So I'm a seed company, and we do have people who buy on contract for us. And folks will come up and say, what do you need to grow? And I do have things that I need people to grow. And that's exciting to do something. But I often rather that somebody knows what they want to grow. So if they say, what do you need to grow? My first question will be, what do you know how to grow? What do you want to grow? So if you do plan on selling seed, think about that before asking what they want. But what my real dream is when somebody shows up and says, I've been growing this squash for 15 years. And it used to have used to be this size, and now it's this size. And the seed cavity has gone small, and there's more flesh. And now it's sweeter than it used to be. And this is my favorite squash. Do you want to buy seed from this? And I love that because, well, it's a unique thing that nobody else has. But I also expect that this person is going to keep stewarding this variety for a long time, and every generation this is going to get better and better. So if I get into a relationship with this person, I'm part of a longer-term project, rather than if it's just somebody that I say I have this, I don't know, jaune flamme tomato seed that I want you to grow out, and I give you some, and you send it back to me, and the next year I have another person grow it. And it's kind of the same seed, but it doesn't have the same stewardship. So I really like when I get into somebody who wants to steward varieties over the long term, and that it's important for them and not just important for my business. Now, in the small seed world, we're not going to talk about that one so much. I think what I'll do is I'm going to say thanks for listening to me so much. I think we have time for some questions. I think we're going to 10, is that right? 11? So we have 10 minutes? 20 minutes? 20 minutes. Okay. Then I think I'm misreading that clock. So I'll go back to this one then, just to talk about this quickly. So on a larger level, companies like High Mowing and Johnny's, they're providing seed to market gardeners. There's smaller bioregional seed companies across the country. There's like Fruition Seed, and there's mentioned before Nature and Nurture and Ann Arbor Seeds. There's Uprising Seeds, Adaptive Seeds. There's all kinds of small seed companies. And most of them, when you look in their catalogs, they mostly have small garden packets. And farmers don't tend to buy the bulk of their seed there. And one of the things they'll say is that they don't have enough supply for my farm. And it's a funny thing. Well, it's a tricky situation because if a seed company doesn't have the volumes that the market gardener needs, they won't buy those seeds, right? So if I don't have that supply, that demand is not going to get it from me. But if I grow that, and I grow a lot of beans, like so if I grow, I don't know, 50 pounds of beans in 1 year for my seed company, that might, like a market grower might use 10 pounds of beans on a larger farm. So they might need, like 3 growers could use all my supply, which could also instead be going to put like 5,000 packets of beans into gardeners' hands. So if I want to grow that, if I want to create that supply, I got to grow a lot of beans. But if nobody buys them, that's wasted energy. And that's and there's a lot of beans that have too much. So there's that challenge between how you create the demand and the supply. We've actually launched a seed CSA in our area, so it's not based in the US, but it's based in Canada, where we're taking now orders for January 2020 seed, so a year in advance for certain crops that people use larger amounts, and therefore we can contract our seed growers to produce that. So knowing that we have the sales, we can contract larger amounts to meet that demand. Yep?
Do you give a discount for those orders in advance?
We're not giving a discount on that. Now we do work with a couple groups, so if people are part of those groups, we do give a discount, but we'll give them a discount anyway if they order other seed. But so we're not doing this based on price. So something like Brassica Greens, we're able to produce seeds at a bulk level that are comparable to Johnny's or High Mowing in terms of pricing. Beans, we can't. They're getting their beans from Idaho growers who are growing large fields that are combining them. You know, we're harvesting the plants by hand, and we're threshing them with a small thresher, and then we're hand picking afterwards. So our prices are maybe about 30 or 50% more on the beans, and we need that price to get it. So what people are getting is actually supporting a local seed economy, and that's the reason you do it, not because you want to save money. Down the line, if there is a big enough seed economy, maybe there will be money savings that happen if there's certain infrastructure, certain I guess benefits that develop. But on the short term, it's because people want to do it that it's important. So thank you for listening to me so far. So as I mentioned, I have a blog, going to seed.net, where I write about seed production. And if you want to read about that kind of stuff, I encourage it. I also have an occasional newsletter that you can sign up for, where I write, again, mostly about seeds and small farms. And we've got time for questions. And I'm sure somebody has a question.
So I've been considering grafting the tomatoes. Can you still save those seeds from your heirloom, the scion?
So you've been grafting the tomatoes,
Yeah, with like Maxiport or something.
but it's an OP heirloom that you put on it. So if you have an heirloom, so grafting is you have a good rootstock, and then you cut the top off and you put your heirloom on it, and that rootstock is resistant to the seed diseases. So the fruits that are on that plant is purely the genetics of the heirloom. So if you save those seeds, you're only getting the heirloom seeds. And there's no disease resistance that they're developing because of that rootstock. So that's not, so if you wanted that disease resistance, you'd have to be selecting off of the rootstock plants. And I don't think those taste so great. Good question. Another question?
Some of the plants you mentioned that have little to no natural crossing, like tomatoes.
Yeah.
What's the reason for that?
I know the reason for some, but not for all. Okay. So most crops are cross-pollinating. Okay. Plants, like humans and like animals, can suffer from inbreeding depression. And so inbreeding depression comes when you have two individuals that mate that have too close genetics. And you will see different problems that come out of that. And in the plant world, that can result in worse disease resistant, lower yield, kind of runtier plants, lack of photosynthetic ability. And plants don't want that. So they do everything they can to avoid inbreeding depression. And so they try to find ways to pollinate. That's their survival mechanism. Now, there are some plants that don't suffer from inbreeding depression. And I know in the case of squash, at some point, a number of thousands of years ago, there was a bottleneck that happened where there was a lot more squash biodiversity and most of it was lost. And the plants that we have left are plants that are resistant to inbreeding depression because they've been selected so narrowly during that time. And that means we don't have that great diversity of the past, but we can work with those. For other crops that don't suffer from inbreeding depression, there's tomatoes, beans, peas, lettuce. There's like wheat, oats. No, or oats. I think oats are self-pollinating. I know rye isn't, but a number of grains are. But there's only about a dozen or so. And so some of them, it's also just how biologically their flowers are made so that pollen doesn't come in from outside easily. And so over years, they just eliminated the traits that, or the genes that would have suffered from inbreeding depression. And there's a possibility that some of these crossers, with intense selection over thousands of years, we could also do the same thing. But we don't have that kind of patience. Does that answer that?
Yeah, so the flower might just somehow physically not accept the pollen from.
Well, yes. I don't have a board, but if you look at a squash flower, it's open and you can see the stamen, the pistils, all the stuff, depending if it's a male or female. But you can see everything there, and the bees have total access. If you look at a pea flower or a tomato flower, you have to peel back layers to get to those parts. And so all those petals that are wrapped around, that creates the physical barrier. Now, an insect can bite through that stuff to get to the pollen, and if it does it to another one, there can be cross-pollination. In some cases in tomatoes, the pistils will go a little bit outside of those petals, and there's more cross-pollination. But overall, there isn't. It's a very low rates, and it's just the biology of the flower. And for whatever reason that those crops are more resistant to inbreeding depression has meant that that trait hasn't been selected against naturally. There was another hand. Yeah.
You talked about fermenting the seeds of tomatoes. Is
Yeah.
that required of things like cubits and the squashes and peppers?
So we'll ferment the seeds of tomatoes. And so your question is, what other seeds can be fermented or should be fermented?
Or that you don't have to ferment the seeds?
Yeah. So we ferment tomato seeds, and that one we definitely ferment. We also ferment cucumber seeds, but for a shorter period, sort of like 12 hours or so. And sometimes like not a watermelon, but a cantaloupe seed we might do for about 12 hours. We don't ferment squash. I know some people do because it makes it easier to clean, but the longer that you ferment the squash, the more chance you have of damaging the germination of it and lowering the quality of the seed. So it's really just the tomatoes that we're really fermenting. Peppers we don't ferment. Eggplants we've tried, but we've moved away from, and we're not sure what we like. But yeah. Okay. Other questions?
How did you become so knowledgeable on all this?
How did I become so knowledgeable about seeds? That's a good question. And
Family or
it's something I discovered myself. So when I started farming, I got into farming because I was interested in vegetables and food systems and food availability. And I was working on a farm, and there was another farm close by that I went to visit, and a couple of employees there loved seeds. And I hadn't really thought about that much, but they were really into seed saving, and they were saving some red Russian kale seed that year. And I saw that there was seed everywhere. Stuff goes to seed. It's the weeds, you see it. And so I was a younger farmer then, maybe a little bit more idealistic, and the thought of growing all your own seed really appealed to me, both from a self-sustaining way and a kind of a frugal nature, but it just seemed to make sense. At this point, as I've said, we only grow 20 to 30% of our own seed, and I don't know that it's going to be much more than that. But so I got into seed production, and there were a couple of great books. There's Susan Ashworth's Seed to Seed book that was put out, I think, by Seed Savers Exchange. And then there was another book in Canada called How to Save Seeds. Those two books were good, but there was missing a piece about, in the market garden world at that point, even though there was less diversity of books than now, there were some really great books that taught you how to do everything on a market garden level. And there wasn't that in terms of seeds. And so I started asking other seed companies about stuff, and I learned that some of the smallest ones had the same questions I did. High Mowing is a place that I went to a lot and talked to Tom Stearns, and they taught a lot. But what really made the biggest difference was going to the Organic Seed Alliance conference. So the OSA, Organic Seed Alliance, is an organization based out of Washington, and they're working with promoting open pollinated seeds and plant breeding for organic systems. And they have a biennial conference every 2 years in January or February. And so I went in 2008, and I had my mind blown. And everybody from all the seed company was there. There was like something like 300 or 400 people, and everybody was sharing everything. They were sharing their financials and their numbers, but they were sharing their breeding techniques, and they were sharing everything. And I learned so much in one day. It took me about 2 to 4 years to unpack that experience, And then the next time I went, there was another dump, At this point, I still go and I still learn things, but it's not the same thing. But that was the place that I got the most information from. Since then, there's been a couple really good books that have been published. NOFA New York has one that's, I don't remember the name, but so I won't talk about it. But there's one, John Navazio has published a book through Chelsea Green called The Organic Seed Grower. And this focuses on a dozen of the most common seed crops. And it's really, so John Navazio was with OSA. Now he's a plant breeder at Johnny's, and he really knows his stuff. And this book is phenomenal. So that would be the best book to go at. There's another book called The Seed Garden, which is also published by Seed Savers Exchange. And it's sort of the second edition of Seed to Seed, but there's less diversity of crops, but a little bit more information. So those are the books that are there. But I've had to piece together a lot of what I know. And that's something that's why I give workshops and why I write about this stuff, is that we need examples of growing seed. There's Jean-Martin Fortier, who's a great example of market gardener. And there's all these people who are making $1 million on small acreage of vegetables. I'm not going to preach that from seed. that's not the message here. But there aren't examples of market gardeners that are doing this profitably that are as clearly found. So we're trying to kind of portray that it can be done. And I haven't talked too much about why save seed. I've kind of assumed that you guys wanted to save seed, which is why you're here. The previous speaker talked a little bit more about why saving seed. But saving seed is important. And sometimes we come to saving seed because we want to save money. And that's the wrong reason. Saving seed is work. So maybe putting that work into something else may have been more profitable, though you can save money in it. But I think saving seed there's a lot of reasons to save seed. Two of the ways that I often think about it, there's the apocalyptic scenario, and then there's sort of a more optimistic scenario. But in a case where we are in rougher times, like right now, we are in an amazing time. There is so much good seed available through mail order companies. There is fantastic quality seed. Even if it's not saved in our area, it can usually thrive in our area. And we're really fortunate to have that. And I hope that economic conditions and social stability and all that gets better and maintains so that still is the case. But things change. And the island of Cuba, they had a system that was very input dependent. And in the late 80s, when the Soviet Union fell, they were the main suppliers of agricultural inputs to Cuba, and suddenly they didn't have that supply. And they're a small island, so they don't have crazy resources. And they had to flip their systems into organic systems to be able to learn how to be able to maintain food production. And part of that was seed production. They had to start saving seeds so that they'd have them. And now, for the crops that do well there, they grow most of their own seed. And that can happen. We live in a pretty big continent, so it's unlikely that we don't have access to different climates, but things change. And so if you want to have access to good seed down the line, being self-reliant increases that capacity. Because if the seed is suddenly no longer there, we don't have the genetics to kind of work with. It's going to take us a number of years to start improving them. We also don't have the skills because it's a trade or it's a skill set. Just like farming, farming is often devalued kind of in a larger world, but it is so much work and so much learning. I'm sure I don't have to convince any of you here that you can't just jump into farming. You know, it's the same thing as being a mechanic or an engineer or a doctor. It takes years to learn this. And so seed saving is the same thing. So if we don't have people in our bioregions learning how to do that, we won't have that. So that's kind of the post-apocalyptic scenario. And that motivates some of us. But it's a place you don't want to live in too much either, kind of working from fear. But there's also a place where when you save your own seed, it gets better. And every generation it gets better, and it changes. And seed becomes something of the land. And you start to have varieties that no one else has. And there's the word terroir, which is a French word, and they talk about like, you know, something that has the flavor of the land. And if you go into Europe, you have a pepper that they've been growing for 400 years, you know, or wines that are longer, and they're tied to specific areas. And there are some cases of that, like the Walla Walla onions, or there's certain things we have that in North America, but we don't have a true terroir. Though most of us try to market that we do on our farms when we're talking to chefs and otherwise. But if you start saving seed and you're selecting and getting unique varieties and varieties that really reflect the region you're in, you will develop a true food culture. And it's something that we've had in the past and that we can have again. And so when you're in area, and that's kind of the beauty of heirloom seeds when they're from your area, is that you can work on that. And so this is kind of, saving seed is you're building towards a better food culture. And that's a really good reason to do it. But it also brings us into connection with the history of humanity. And so we started living together in cities. We were living together for a long time before that. But civilization that we think of started when we started saving seeds and farming. And it's that seed saving is a big part of it. And people have been saving seeds for 10, 15, 20,000 years. And they don't have university degrees. And they've changed plants from that were very wild to amazing, like corn. The ancestors of corn, the teosinte, was very different than what it is right now. And this is humans that did it with no university education. And we're tapping, like by becoming seed savers and seed keepers, we continue those traditions. And in some cases, we can reclaim and regain stories that were there beforehand. And in other cases, we're building new stories. So that's kind of the true beauty of seed saving. And there can be a profitability in that. If you have a unique variety that defines your bioregion, hey, that sells better. But it's not just about money. It's about really like putting the sustainable in sustainability. It's really building a true sustainability culturally and agriculturally. That's the reason to save seed. And it's a big thing to ask, but you start with one variety. And if different people are doing it, you can work together. And there's definitely an interest in saving more seed and in seed that's local. And it's easier than you think. And there's a lot of people who are already doing it who are more than happy to share what they know. So if you haven't saved seed, who here already saved seed? So there's already a sprinkling of seed savers. And I hope that the next times the hands are higher. I'm not going to ask who's going to save seed. I won't make you commit. But I would encourage you to save some seed and to understand how seed crops work.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay. Thank you very much.